You hear a lot of people complain these days about people immigrating to other countries. Today, many people move to other countries for reasons such as employment, family, or safety from a dangerous situation. That wasn't always the case for many countries in the past. 1,000 years ago, it was common for outsiders to arrive and raid the foreign land, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Sometimes, though, they just never left. The early Viking raids in Ireland, which occurred during the late 8th and early 9th centuries, marked a significant turning point in the history of the Emerald Isle. These raids, carried out by Viking seafarers from Scandinavia, marked the beginning of what is now known as the Viking Age in Ireland. It's a time that left indisputable changes in the country's culture and society, with impacts that we can still see to this day. The first recorded Viking raids in Ireland began in 795 when raiding parties started to target coastal islands. As the decades passed and the raids became more efficient, the Vikings were able to travel further inland and establish encampments along the coastline, which allowed them to winter in Ireland. That sparked many native Irish communities to migrate away from their home and settle in places like Iceland. The raids were swift and would occur without warning. Villagers had little time to prepare themselves before the raiders were storming through, taking what items they could. But it wasn't just goods the Vikings took. They also took people whom they often sold off as slaves. In 821, a large raid took place in Howth, Dublin, which saw a large number of women taken. That marked a change in the Vikings' raiding style. Now, the inland settlements that were once thought to be safe from the attacks were also being targeted as the raiders grew larger and more effective. Soon, Vikings would arrive in Ireland and settle permanently. Historians believe those raids were not just an attempt to gain goods or wealth, but part of a calculated effort on the part of the King of Laithland to take over Ireland. In 837, there was a notable force shown by the Vikings as a sizable fleet of over 50 longships traveled up the River Liffey, raiding many establishments, including churches and homes as they sailed along. Presumably, they passed through Dublin during those attacks. 4 years later, they returned and the raiders established a naval encampment. That was used as a base to launch further raids to locations like Leinster and further into the Midlands. A particularly violent time followed that saw many Irish dignitaries killed. In 845, another encampment was successfully set up in Tullamore. However, that same year, things would turn in favor of the Irish when the Viking king Turgesius was killed and drowned in Loch Uis. Multiple upsets followed for the Vikings that had settled in Ireland, which all led to the 849 attack on Dublin. Up until that point, the Vikings' naval encampment had still been fully functional. Ireland's High King, Miles Shechnaill, plundered the settlement, and it's believed he had the outpost destroyed. Still, the Vikings wouldn't give up Dublin just yet. Later that year, 140 longships sailed on Dublin, and they began to rebuild the encampment. Things were quiet for the next few years before a new group of Vikings arrived known as the Dubgail, or Dark Foreigners. That new faction plundered the established outpost. The next major milestone in Dublin's history came when Viking warlord Amlaib declared himself king of Dublin. The second phase of raids began in 914 when more Viking ships arrived at Waterford Harbour. That group was able to take over the Vadford, or Waterford, which the Irish had taken from them 50-odd years earlier. The following year, their stronghold was further fortified when a second fleet of ships sailed to Waterford. This enabled the Vikings to travel to Munster and plunder numerous villages throughout the province. 4 years later, Dublin was also recaptured by the Vikings. It had been taken by the Irish in 902. That sparked Ireland's most powerful king, Niall Glundubh, to rally support in favor of banishing the Vikings from their homeland. He brought in help from Leinster and set out to march on the Vikings who had settled in Munster. However, that campaign was entirely unsuccessful. The king tried once more 2 years later, that time setting his sights on Dublin, but his mission failed yet again and even saw Niall Glundubh lose his life. While it was clear some of the Irish wanted the Vikings gone, others used them to their own advantage, forming alliances with the Norsemen. By 921, the Vikings had founded Dublin, Cork, and Waterford, and that same year they founded Wexford. After that came Limerick on the west coast. The focus turned to transforming Dublin into an established trading city. During that time, Dublin was considered one of the most influential Nordic cities in the world. By 950, Viking raids grew infrequent, and instead, the Vikings who were settled in the towns of Dublin, Limerick, Waterford, and others began to settle down and build to the future. However, as the 11th century began, the conditions for Vikings in Ireland were about to change. In 976, Brian Boru was appointed as the new King of Munster, and one of his main priorities was to rid Ireland of the Vikings. That got off to a successful start when he defeated Norse warriors at the Battle of Limerick in 977. While Brian held notable power over Ireland, with some historians believing he could be considered Ireland's first king, the Vikings still had firm ties in and around Dublin and Leinster. They called on those allies to stand against Brian, which they did, a move that resulted in the Battle of Clontarf that took place in 1014. The battle saw Irish forces battle Norse Vikings and their allies, with the Irish ultimately coming out on top, though Brian and up to 10,000 men died during the battle. The year that led to the Battle of Clontarf was filled with smaller clashes in East and South Ireland. Brian had concentrated on strengthening Munster while simultaneously campaigning against Dublin and Leinster. Brian later set off for Dublin with his son Murhad, sent to launch an attack on Leinster. The actual Battle of Clontarf began in April of 1014 when Brian led a large army to Dublin. Further details of the battle are slim. Various important figures died during the battle, including the King of Leinster, Brian himself, and his son Murhad. Once the battlefield calmed, Brian's army returned home. The result of the battle saw the Vikings' might in Ireland greatly reduced, and in 1171, England's Henry II invaded Ireland and took hold of Dublin, casting the city under the English crown for centuries that followed. One of the most notable pieces of Viking presence in modern-day Ireland is the magnificent Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. The construction began in 1030, almost 1,000 years ago, under the Norse ruler who resided over the city at the time. Thanks for letting us tell you this sinister story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on, and hit like, rate it, or leave a comment. Join us next week when we'll take you somewhere sinister.